Hey guys, so this is Josh flying solo today, just taking precautions and that kind of stuff. But welcome to the Thrive Podcast second episode. I want to welcome you guys. Today we want to be talking about, or I'd like to talk to you guys about tithing. Some of you guys might have heard that. It's kind of a churchy word, but it's super, super important, and it's talked about all through the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so I just kind of wanted to unpack that with you guys a little bit today, just super briefly, because it's something that if you do it, you will be blessed. And if you don't do it, it doesn't make you a horrible person, but we're missing something that God has really put a lot of importance on in the Bible. So let's dive in with that. So tithe, what is it, right? It literally means a tenth, right? But when God is talking about it, it's not just a tenth, but it's also the first. So first time we see it mentioned in the Bible is really with actually Cain and Abel. So I'm going to read a little bit from that, and we'll kind of unpack that a little bit here. So in Genesis 4, verse 3, in the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain, his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. So, unpacking just a little bit from what we can see there. Obviously, you can see that Cain just kind of brought something. It wasn't the first. It doesn't even necessarily say that it was the best or worst, but it definitely wasn't the first. Abel brought some of the firstborn of his flock. Now, as we start to unpack what tithing is, obviously it's a tenth, but in God's command towards us, or his will in this area, it's also the first. That's a pretty important piece there too. So as we kind of dive into what that looks like in our lives for today, obviously none of us are going out and sacrificing the firstborn of our cats or our dogs or something like that. It's not an animal sacrifice anymore that we're doing. We're doing it primarily with our money now, and so I want to keep that in mind as well. Why is this important? Because really, if you look at what you're willing to give first, it's a good indicator of where your heart's at, and that's really with a lot of stuff that God goes after in the Old Testament and the New Testament is heart issue stuff. So, first is the most important. God didn't say, in the Old Testament stories, God didn't say like, well, hey, after you have your full flock and you've got all this stuff, go ahead and pick from that flock and give me whatever one you want. He's wanting the best. If we look at the stories that we've been talking about we're about to talk about once we gather back, with Joshua and Jericho, it's very interesting that Jericho was the first city that the Israelites conquered as they went into the Promised Land. And God had them give everything from that city, the treasure, everything like that. That was because it was the first city that they took. After that, everything else was blessed. All the other cities that they took were good. And God went after that pretty intentionally. The reason why the first is so important is because that is where God has placed the blessing on the first. And so when we look at why tithing is so important, first I think we need to understand what it is. So like I said before, it's a tenth of whatever you bring in. So if we're looking at it in today's context, it's a tenth of whatever you earn money-wise, right? So you take that and it's given back to God. And even with a given part, I was listening to a sermon by Transformation Church, and I absolutely love what the pastor was riffing on with it. But he was talking about how we're actually stealing from God if we don't give the tithe. The tithe isn't something that God says to give, because it's in the context of how we're reading it, right? Everything is God's, right? We don't own any of it like it's ours. So when God says to bring the tithe and the offering, you're bringing something that's already God's to begin with. You can't give somebody something that isn't yours, right? that doesn't work too well. The tithe is also constantly referred to as the first fruits or the firstborn, all that kind of stuff. I also found it really interesting. This pastor also tied it into looking at the person of Jesus. Jesus is referred to as the first of many brethren, the new Adam, the firstborn that was totally righteous and without fault, anything like that. And if you look at some of the Old Testament, how they redeemed certain things or how they sacrificed, it was huge emphasis placed on first and also an emphasis placed on pure. And so when we look at what Jesus was to us, Jesus is God's tithe, like the firstborn, the best, the redeeming, blessed possession of God was given, and we get the blessing from all of that. So just kind of an interesting tidbit on that too, and really looking at tithe as a principle, because if we hear the word and we think, oh well, okay, it's Old Testament, I don't really want to give a tenth of whatever I'm making to God. That was old, everything like that. Well, I challenge you with that, because Jesus even references it in the New Testament. He talks about it, and if it's important to Jesus, it should be important to us. So the other story I wanted to tackle is with Abram. So Abraham, tithe is also mentioned as well. This comes after Abram goes out and totally kicks booty and is rescuing Lot. And so he totally goes and, as an older man, goes and just totally annihilates this this group of people that were trying to mess with his family member. And he beats them, takes all their treasure, and then it says in chapter 14, verse 18, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. He blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. Then Abram gave him a tenth of everything that he got. Super, super important to see that as well, that it was like Abram wasn't holding anything back. He was grateful, and he knew where that blessing and where that victory came from. When we understand where our possessions come from, where that God is our provider, that he's the one sustaining all this stuff, it gets a whole lot easier to give a tenth of whatever you're making, but it also gives you a proper understanding of you're merely bringing it back to him. It's not something that you're actually even giving, because giving means you possessed it in the first place, right? Or does that make sense? I hope that makes sense to you guys with what I'm getting at there. When we don't tithe, when we hold that money back, we are, biblically, if you look at it, we are stealing from God. And that was really convicting to me, especially after I heard this sermon, where I'm like, okay, that doesn't belong to me. When I'm earning an income, or when I'm getting paid for something, that's God's blessing. That's God's goodness being poured out on me. And how I say thank you, or how I give proper perspective, or how I protect my own heart from, like, who's first in my heart? Is God first in my heart? If God's first in my heart, I'm gonna bring it right back to him. And in doing so, there will be a blessing, right? It also requires a lot of faith. So when we are giving, when we are tithing, there's a lot of faith required there, because sometimes, man, tithing that first 10%, it can be risky. So I brought a couple of objects here to demonstrate that. So say you're working. So, right, some of you guys have a job, you have a way of earning income, that kind of thing, and you get paid, right? So the biblical way that we're supposed to tithe, this is the biblical model for what we're supposed to do. So say I get paid. Okay, this is $1,000 right here. Get paid $1,000 cash. Before I figure out what to do with this at all, the first thing I'm called to do biblically is put this aside, put this $100 aside, because that's 10%, and that's God's. Now, I don't give this to charity. I don't give this to necessarily somebody in need. This is God's. This is the first $100 that I made from this 1,000, right? Now I have $900 to figure out what else to do with, right? For some of you guys might have phone bill, right? Or phone bill, okay? So that's $100 here. Some of you guys might want to go eat out, In-N-Out, Chick-fil-A, whatever, Dutch Bros. It costs money. It's great, but it costs money. So that's another $100, right? You want to bless somebody. Somebody, maybe they got sick or they weren't able to work. You got another $100, right? It doesn't matter what you do with the rest of the money after this point. The point is we gave God the first $100. Now, it's also pretty clear here, too. When Abram gave that money to Melchizedek, he gave it to the priest, right? Our current context, our current structure, that's not set up that way. We don't have like one priest. What I think is safe to say in the biblical context here is that it is the local church. So when you give your tithe, give to your local church, give to your home church where you go. That belongs to God. It doesn't belong to you. It goes back to God in that context. And so I want to encourage you guys that if you're not doing that right now, this is one of those areas where God even says, hey, test me in this. See how good I am when you do this. And if you're willing to, right off the top of the bat, right, you get that $1,000 or however much you make, right off the top, you give 10%, or bring that 10% back to God, set it aside, give it to Him, and figure out what to do with the rest of the money. You will be blessed by that. God will honor that, and God sees that. And that is another act of worship that we can do that's very practical. It's very difficult because it does cost us something. It's not something that is free from worry or anything like that. But I think that as we develop this, and especially if you can develop this at a young age, it will be a discipline. It will be something that serves you well, and it will be something that God will be able to trust you with more things because He knows, hey, He's got your heart. He can bless you with more money. He can bless you with more things because He knows that you're going to give Him the first 10%. You're going to bring back that first 10%. You're going to offer that back in a heart of thanksgiving and gratitude, and you understand where it's coming from. It's not something that you're doing on your own and you can just fend for yourself kind of thing. If we really buy into that and we really believe that the earth is God's and everything in it, and He provides for us and meets our needs, this shouldn't be as difficult as it is. An alarming statistic that I've also heard from several pastors and churches alike, most people, and again, I hope, if this is convicting, good. If you're already tithing, great, okay? But most people, churchgoers in America, don't tithe. The overwhelming majority don't tithe. Even pastors, there's a high percentage of pastors that don't tithe. Now, this is something where biblically we're called to do it, and God lays out why, God lays out the blessing, God lays out all this kind of stuff. So it boils down to, it's a heart issue. Where is God first in our hearts, and are we willing to obey Him even when it costs us something? And the emphasis of being first. If it's not first, we go back to with Cain and Abel. God wasn't impressed. Cain gave an offering. He gave a tithe, so to speak, but not in the way that God had instructed. Abel was the one that gave the first and the best, and was blessed by it. So another example of this that I wanted to illustrate, that my daughter actually did, and it really, really blessed me. And I was like, man, but kind of captured what I was going at here. This is a different category, right? Because she just kind of went total, I love my dad and I care and everything like that. So with my daughter, I made her this little box, and she likes earning money, doing little things, little chores around the house, everything like that. So I made her this little box, and I said, $3 inside, right? We colored it, put her name on it, everything like that. And I gave her $3, right? Kind of crumpled up. You can kind of see $3, right? About a week and a half ago, she heard that my birthday was coming up, right? And she gets all excited. I come home from work and she's got like this little bag and has handmade some cards. She's got 2 cards in there, and I open up the cards and she's got like taped to the inside of the card. She has 2 of her $3. She gave those to me just to say, "Oh, Daddy, I love you, and happy birthday," and everything like that. It was also interesting, like acknowledging in that moment that she knew where the money came from. She was just giving it back to me, right? Or offering it back. I thought it was really powerful too, because that was, she only had $3 to her name, and she gave me 2 of that 3 back. Now, as a father, right, as an earthly father, I'm obviously I'm not going to keep the $2. I'm going to give it back to her. That's not the point. The point in that, I know that my daughter loves me. I know that her heart connection to me is there. I also know that she understands that I gave her that money for her. She's just giving it back, right? Offering it back. Really, really powerful example to me, at least, of what that looks like for us. And yeah, so the stuff that God calls us to in this, it doesn't change. God's eternal. He doesn't change his mind on stuff. So the God of Genesis, the God of Exodus, the God of the whole Bible into today, his principles haven't changed. His heart for us hasn't changed. And there are things that he cannot do, right? He cannot lie. He cannot be false, right? He's good. He's caring. He's loving. Those are things that he is, like that he can't compromise his character. And so when he says something, he said it back in the Old Testament. Well, it's still true today. When he says, "Do this and I will bless you." There's another passage that I wanted to kind of close with here in Proverbs, where he's also talking about this, where, let's see, where is it here? "Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops. Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine." Obviously, okay, most of you guys shouldn't be making wine, right? But that's not the point. In the point, in the context here, wine had value. Wine was a good thing. Barns, that was a good thing. You're storing up stuff. When it says here, "Honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all of your crops," when we decide and make that conscious decision and create a discipline or a new habit of tithing, every time you get that paycheck, first 10%, bring it back to God, right? That's not yours. That's God's. And there is a blessing on that 10%, on that first 10%, that you will realize and you will see as you develop that habit and as you develop that practice, where God will bless it. God will be with you with that, and he will continue to show you things and give you things. If you're not doing that right now, you're not going to hell. It's not something where you're living in sin or anything like that necessarily, but it is something that God has called us to. And if we're not aware of it, or if we're not paying attention to it, like I hope that through talking about this today, that you guys will become more aware of that, and that understanding where it goes, right? So it's 10% of the very beginning, the very first thing that you get. Where it goes is your local church. That's where it goes. Whatever you want to do with the rest of your money, that's up to you. You can offer that to other people. You can give that to charities. You can buy somebody lunch. You can go, do whatever needs you have at that point. But it's going after that, and what that exercise will do. And as you discipline yourself and you get more invested in that, what you'll see is more and more of your heart is totally God's. Your faith will be built, your love with God will be built, and it will be built stronger and more healthy as we practice this. So thank you guys for tuning in. I hope that you guys feel encouraged, and that you're encouraged to go out and tithe from that first 10% of whatever it is that you bring in, your first fruits, bringing that back to God. Thanks, guys.